Ryan, it's great to see you today.
Thank you so much for inviting me on again.
So, Ryan, a lot's been going on for the last couple of weeks, and the news is just full time about Ukraine and what's going to happen next, what's going to happen with Russia. And you've been following Ukraine and the war since the very beginning. In fact, you're one of the most popular guys analyzing the war on YouTube. So, what's your take? What's been going on and what's happening?
Essentially, I think that President Trump has resorted to a new strategy of disengagement from Ukraine, of forcing Europe to kind of grow up and come to terms with the fact that it needs to provide for its own defense as the president pivots over to Asia. And I think it's one of those things where he doesn't particularly care whether Ukraine wins or loses more. What he really cares about is kind of getting focused on stopping China as a threat. I think that's kind of what we're seeing right now.
So, in the short term, what will this look like for Ukraine?
Short term, there's some issues. Right now, Ukraine is no longer gathering intelligence from U.S. sources, which means that it will have a degraded response when it comes to knowing when Russian bombers are taking off from Russian bases. That can make it a lot harder for Ukraine to shoot down incoming cruise missiles. That's an issue. Weapons side, a lot of the weapons that Ukraine uses to defend its territory are US made. And even in cases where we've sold similar weapons to Germany or the UK, for example, the Patriot system, just because Germany owns some Patriot cans, I mean the physical missiles, it doesn't actually mean you can go selling them to Ukraine or donating them to Ukraine without the United States signing off. So just because you own weapon systems doesn't mean you can actually transfer them to somebody else. So that is an issue as well. Europe is going to have to help fund Ukraine with homegrown weapon systems that don't use American tech. So those are the two biggest issues facing Ukraine right now.
So, Ryan, that's a good point. But looking at that, isn't it sort of crazy? European countries bought US made weapons or made their own weapons with US made parts so that they could defend themselves. And at present, they're saying we wish to defend ourselves because we think that Russia is a threat to us. And so we wish to help Ukraine. We wish to arm Ukraine because if we can stop Russia there, it means they won't come to our borders. And the US can veto that. And that's something that's not just recent. That happened under the Biden administration as well. But overall, what does this mean? Doesn't it mean that buying US weapons is actually a risk? How if the Americans just say, sorry, you can't use them that way? Because, that might create a conflict for us in the future. We're very far away. We've got a big, beautiful ocean between us and Europe. So we don't want this war to get any further out of control. How is that going to work out for the US arms industry?
In some ways, that is always in a standard contract. Why let's say the Turks can't take a C-130 transport and turn it into a gunship without U.S. permission, right? When we perform any kind of foreign arms sale, there are rules attached to that sale that we have to approve any modifications, or we have to approve any third-party foreign sales. That being said, Europe is already looking at ways around U.S. weapon systems, uh, relying on more homegrown defense possibilities. I believe Rafael's stock is up 20%. The French company, Rafael, the French defense company, Thales. They right now Europe is looking at America and they're starting to realize that America might not necessarily be an ally when it comes to allowing them to use weapons the way they see fit. And if America can literally turn off the flow of weapon systems on a whim, that really degrades the ability of your country to defend itself. So that is certainly a long-term issue that America will face going forward with these current policies.
Do you see any upsides, though, for the US arms industry or the US as a whole from what's currently going on in terms of Europe?
Well, I suppose one of the upsides might be that the U.S. can perhaps focus more on developing cheap missiles and cheap drones, which they would have to do because they would be selling fewer weapon systems or fewer standardized weapon systems to Europe. There is a finite amount of tooling and capacity. And so, if U.S. arms manufacturers could change that capacity to service more Pacific-oriented weapons, that could be a win, but I don't really foresee that being that much of an issue. And I certainly don't see the any kind of buildup in the Pacific competing with the current weapon systems that we sell to Europe.
Let's talk about Asia a little bit. So if the US is pivoting more towards Asia as being the priority, which is something it's planning to do for a while, what does that actually mean, though, for US-Russian relations? Obviously, Russia has a very large interest in Asia. But do you think that the US will be working closer with Russia in Asia, or as it has been talked about many times, that the Russian-Chinese alliance is something that is a threat to the US, and hence by breaking that, by the US, for instance, working closer with Russia, it would defend the US's interest. Do you think that's the direction we're going?
That could be a strategy that the president is implementing. Look, if the U.S. gives sanctions relief to Russia, and we have some sort of bilateral treaty between the United States and Russia to help contain China, that could certainly turn the tables on China as a global power. Whether that is the moral thing to do is certainly a question. Whether that is the sensible thing to do is a question as well, because Putin tends to break his promises. But that is certainly a theory of why the U.S. is pursuing this strategy.
It's hard to imagine why, though, we would want to work with Russia against China. Russian-Chinese trade is only about 2% of total Chinese trade, versus US trade with China and our allies in Europe as well as in Asia is more than 60% of Chinese trade. So clearly, we have much stronger economic ties to China than Russia does. It would actually seem that Russia offers us very little. What leverage does Russia give us by working with them against China?
I don't know if it's leverage as much as it is you have someone who could potentially destabilize China with maybe perhaps a ground invasion. It's something that could keep Chinese troops in a certain area while the United States goes about doing its business in the South China Sea. So that could certainly be an option, or it could just be we're literally paying Russia to do nothing. I mean, do nothing is always an option, right? When in any kind of project management. So if we pay Russia to do nothing, don't cause trouble in Europe, don't cause trouble in China, just do nothing while we take care of things in the Pacific, then at least we have a neutral party instead of a hostile party.
That's a really good point. Let's look at what's happening now, though. Let's imagine that the US does fully pull out of Ukraine and the Europeans aren't able to assist as much as they would like to, and Russia just starts to gain terrain. Do you think that's
Mhm.
possible? And what ramifications would it have on the United States if Ukraine went the direction of, let's say, the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, just a total collapse? What would happen?
That's actually a very good question. I think a total collapse would not be helpful to the president's legacy. But I also don't believe that Ukraine will ever get into total collapse. Um, we're talking about a people who fought for 3 years. I think that they would go to ground and turn all of Ukraine into a gigantic insurgency that would make Iraq look like an episode of Teletubbies. I mean, we're not. These are people who do not want to live under the Russian boot. And if Russia wants another Afghanistan, I have no doubt in my mind that the Ukrainians will give it to them. So I don't necessarily see Russia gaining so much ground that they actually take over the country. There's been some whispers that Russia might try another invasion from the north with 6 divisions, and I'm thinking six divisions from where, right? Like, so where are they getting these magical divisions? So I don't really see that as an option. I see Russia perhaps slowly gaining ground over the course of years if Ukraine decides to stay the course.
So, looking ahead, do you think that it's realistic that the peace talks that are allegedly beginning will
Mhm.
have success? And what do you think it'll look like? But more long term, what do you think the ramifications are if Russia is able to keep territories? That is, that Russia doesn't have to pay recompense to Ukraine for having invaded. It doesn't have to be shamed anymore before the international community, but essentially gets away with the crime. Do you think
Mhm.
that's going to hurt not only Europe's security, but also America's prestige globally? And what other effects will it have?
It's an excellent question. And I can tell you that I'm more of a weapons guy than a geopolitics guy. To frame this in the term of weapons, I think that keeping some of these provinces, uh, specifically Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, areas of Kherson, what you could end up with is an insurgency there, which is just this slow grinding war that never quite ends. So I could certainly see that. And you said Russia won't pay for it. They'll certainly pay for it in the sense that now they have these four half provinces that are have a relatively porous border and a motivation for Ukraine to smuggle weapons over the border with. Um, that is kind of the nightmare scenario for Russia, where they have all of these new provinces, or oblasts, but they can't do anything with them because there is such a heavy insurgency going on inside those provinces. So I could see that.
That's interesting. So describe to me,
Yeah,
what does an insurgency actually look like? Obviously, there's people who are resisting the new power that's come to town,
yeah.
but on a day-to-day level, for instance, the example you gave earlier was Iraq, or other historical examples, what does it actually look like?
It would look like killing Russian soldiers randomly. It would look like using IEDs to blow up convoys. It would look like performing hit and run attacks against Russian bases, or even things like mortars. Like, for example, the Irish Republican Army used to fire homemade mortars at British police barracks. We might see something like that. It could even take the place of or manifest itself in recording all these events on video. I mean, remember, the whole purpose of the insurgency in Iraq was to generate video for the insurgency in Iraq and convince fighters to come and fight on the side of the insurgents. So I could easily see this turning into a very well photographed war where every single insurgent has a GoPro or a cell phone and they're recording this for the political cause, throwing it up on YouTube or throwing it up on Telegram as combat footage, saying, "See, we haven't stopped fighting. Look how weak the Russian army is. They can't even fight a bunch of insurgents." So I could see something like that happening. The kind of the disadvantage is that area isn't very mountainous. It's very flat, a lot of farmland, but there are still cities. And for an insurgency to work, you need the population to agree to back the insurgency. So that might be that might be a difficulty as well. If there's a number of people still remaining there who consider themselves Ukrainian, that'll be a lot different than if there's a lot of people there who kind of side with Russia just on general principles.
So currently on the battlefield, what are you seeing there? What's been happening recently in the war?
Uh, What used to be trench assaults has now been mainly replaced by first-person view drones. A lot of Russian drones are now fiber optic drones. So what we're seeing is Russians are shooting drones toward Ukrainian lines, and behind them are being spooled this trail of fiber optic cable, so that way these drones can't be jammed. We're also seeing advances in technology approximately every 6 to 8 weeks. So when the war started, we saw advancements in technology every 6 to 8 months. Now it's down to roughly 6 to 8 weeks. So that's kind of what we're seeing now. Russia is now using another thing. Russia's now using golf carts, pack animals to bring in supplies. They're also using motorbikes to quickly move across farmland. So we've seen the Russians adapt with how they actually perform these attacks, and we're also seeing fewer Russian armored vehicles as well.
So let me follow up with two questions.
Mhm.
When you say that there's advancements every 6 to 8 weeks, what sort of advancements do you mean? And secondly, you said that you see a lot less of the armored vehicles coming from Russia. Why is that?
Russia's essentially, they haven't run out of armored vehicles, but they have run out of armored vehicles from the Soviet era that can be quickly repaired. So they are scraping the bottom of the barrel with salvageable equipment. A lot of their depots are essentially empty. And one of their main issues is just simple armored transport vehicles, MTLBs. They're gone. There's essentially no more MTLBs, these battle taxis that can move goods and move supplies and move people to the front. There's essentially no more of them in the inventory at all. Russia's lost them all. So Russia is at the point now where it is very difficult to keep up with arming armored and mechanized units effectively. They're never going to run out of tanks, so to speak, but what we might see are units with fewer tanks. Instead of 12 vehicles in a company of tanks, you might see seven. So that's kind of a big issue. And you can see this on satellite. A YouTube channel called Covert Cabal has done some excellent work looking at satellite footage of these shrinking Russian depots.
What else do you see happening on the Russian side? Can you tell if there's been any changes in types of soldiers that they're using, or are there any other sort of problems that you've noticed within the army itself?
Not recently. Of course, there's been that big pivot to Korea. That could be considered a difference. Uh, Russia is still using kontraktniki. They're still using contract soldiers to do a lot of their fighting. And of course, they have to keep raising the amount of money they're offering to the kontraktniki in order to fight. But I haven't really seen any unique or original things coming from Russia when it comes to the individual infantrymen. It seems like their kit is pretty much the same as it's been for the past 3 years or so. So I can't really give you anything there, although the Koreans really have made a very different kind of impact and are probably the biggest event to come out in the past 3 years, at least since conscription was attempted in 2022 in October, I believe, September, October 2022. Russia tried conscription. That was an absolute disaster. And I think that's one of the reasons they're kind of leaning on North Korea now, because they know they can't institute conscription in Russia or else there'll essentially be a revolution.
So, are there currently North Korean soldiers fighting with the Russians against Ukraine?
Yeah,
Because I've read,
absolutely. I mean, Ukraine's captured some of these guys. They've captured two of these guys at least. So they're definitely there, and I believe they're reinforced with another 2,000, although I haven't verified that.
so looking ahead, what do you think we might see in the coming weeks or months on the battlefield?
I actually don't really foresee any kind of major change other than what we've been seeing now. We're going to see Russia deploying glide bombs, probably at a higher rate because they are a very effective and inexpensive weapon. We're going to see Ukrainians continue to kill Russians by the bushel using these suicide drones, FPV drones. We could see the United States stop issuing ammunition. We could see them not reissue ammunition or intelligence, which would certainly make the fight harder. But I don't really foresee any kind of major Russian breakthrough just because they don't have the troops who can actually afford or exploit this breakthrough. And what we might see is, I could see Volodymyr Zelensky considering stepping down if that means a weapons deal. And I could see Ukraine allowing conscription of soldiers between 18 and 25, which is something they have avoided for a while. But from a political standpoint, that is very difficult for Ukraine to look at the U.S. and ask for weapon systems when it hasn't pulled into its full population of young people in order to fight in the front lines. So that could be something that Ukraine might consider as a full mobilization, even though it could mean trouble for their demographics in the future.
So that's actually a very interesting point. Let's imagine that. Let's imagine that tomorrow Volodymyr Zelensky were to step down per the request of Washington, or otherwise they had elections and he left. But as a result of that, they were able to cut a deal that they were able to get more weapons from the US. Where do you think Ukraine would try to take it from that point? Do you think that it would just continue to try to take back all of the territory? Or would at that point just give them the strength and leverage to start negotiations?
I would probably give them the strength and leverage to start negotiations. Look, when the last time Ukraine tried to take back territory, it was an absolute disaster, and that was because they just didn't have air power. So in order for Ukraine to actually do that, they have to claw back the skies. And that means more Western fighter jets, more Mirages, more F-16s. They might not have that capability for another 2 years, but if they can continue to bleed Russia until 2026, they might have a shot at taking back more land, especially if they have air cover. Air cover is the key. Air cover is the absolute key here. So no matter what happens, I don't really see any kind of major shift to the front lines until at least 2026.
So explain it to me. Why is air cover so critical?
Without air cover, you don't have anything. When one of the reasons that Ukraine's counteroffensive failed was that Russia had multiple lines of defense on their front lines. And soldiers were able to sit in bunkers and fire anti-tank missiles at Ukrainian soldiers who were trying to clear minefields. Mine clearing is hard enough, but when you add in being shot at by anti-tank missiles and add in helicopters, meaning Russian gunships, the Alligators and the Hind gunships, add that in, adding their anti-tank missiles into the mix. That is a very deadly combination. But if you have air dominance, then you can drop JDAMs, you can drop joint direct attack munitions on those bunkers. You can also wipe any helicopters from the sky. So if Ukraine can claw back its air sovereignty, or even if NATO had some kind of no-fly zone, and Ukraine could, if Ukraine can claw back its air sovereignty, or NATO implemented some kind of no-fly zone, it would be very advantageous for Ukraine, and they would be able to slowly roll up on those defenses using air power, which allows their sappers to breach the minefields, which allows them to filter in through those breaching paths and attack from behind. And that's how you get armies to collapse.
Ryan, let me ask you just one last question.
Mhm.
For all the Americans who are looking at the situation, who think it's true, Ukraine is very far away, and it's not going to have as much of an impact on us as it's going to have on the Europeans. What would you say? Would you argue that Ukraine will affect the United States and the outcome of this war matters to America? Or is it true? It's a European problem.
I do not believe that Russia is going to stop at Ukraine. I believe that Russia's ultimate goal is to take Ukraine, install a friendly government in Ukraine, and then take the Baltics and then Poland. And a lot of people kind of roll their eyes at that when I say that because they say, well, the Baltics and Poland are part of NATO. What about Article 5? And we've already proven that Russian disinformation can cause disunity among NATO. And Article 5 is a sword, not a shield. Because when Article 5 is implemented, all you really have to do is provide the kind of aid that your country is able to provide. So I think people like to think that, let's say, Lithuania is invaded by Russia as the first step in the plan. Lithuania invokes Article 5. That means America shows up with aircraft carriers and M1 tanks and Patriot missiles. And we might look at that and go, all right, well, here's some money. I've often said Article 5 is like a birthday party. Some people come to the party and some people Venmo $20, right? And it's still both considered aid under Article 5, right? So we are running the risk of making Article 5 essentially toothless. And if Russia knows that, if they know they can attack a NATO country with impunity, and other countries will hem and haw and say, well, we don't want to go to war with Russia because it might mean nuclear war, then Russia's already taken the Baltics. Now, Poland might be a little different. Poland might have something to say about it. But ultimately, Russia has to take Ukraine, the Baltics, and Poland because it takes their 1,600-mile border down to a manageable 150-mile border. And that is their ultimate goal. So the United States needs to care about that because ultimately Russia will take more of Europe. This will embolden the Chinese to take Taiwan if we don't stand together. And we are getting a fantastic amount of data from Ukraine as to how our weapon systems function and how the next war will be fought. I was just in at a place called JTEC in NATO, this base in Poland, where Ukrainians are working with Polish forces to kind of explain to them what the next war will be like. This is vital information that we're going to throw away if we don't back Ukraine.
Ryan, I appreciate your time today. Thanks.
Thank you so much.